Welcome everybody to the Conversations with the Future. Today we're going to discuss Europe's technological future. My name is Oscar Johnson. I am Academic Director for the Center for the Governance of Change. We're an applied research center who are reinvestigating emerging technologies and their profound social, political, and economic impact. The world is changing in a breakneck speed today, and to understand this and what governments and international organizations should do to govern it, we use a mix of social science, economics, philosophy, ethics, geopolitics to figure out what to do about this. Today's topic is Europeans' technological future. On the one hand, European states are among the most wealthy. It's one of the world's largest markets, but it's thoroughly lacking progress in the digital domain. The cell phones we use, the operating system, the app store where we buy our apps, the social media platforms through which we access the digital world are not European. To give you some numbers, Europe only attracted 11% of global venture capital and corporate funding between 2016 and 2018. Only 4 European companies are among the top 100 in the global AI startups, and none of Europe's top 40 biggest companies were born the last 40 years. So to dig into this contradiction, we have an excellent panel. We have Professor Alexander Stubb, who's now Director of School of Transnational Governments at European University Institute. And he has, frankly, been all the funny ministerial roles you can think of. He's been Prime Minister, Finance Minister, EU Minister, and Foreign Minister for Finland. He's been a member of the European Parliament and Vice President of the European Investment Fund. And he's also running a conversation series a bit like this one called Florence Live. So please look at that one as well. With us as well, we have Professor Nicklas Lundblad, who's Head of Global Policy Planning at Google. He's a professor at the Royal Institute in Engineering.
Not anymore. Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Adjungeringen tog slut förra året, så du får inte fara med osanning här.
That ended last year. And he's written numerous books on technology and society. And he is, frankly, one who you could answer any tricky question you have, and he will come up with a very, very good answer. So with this panel, we're going to dig deeper into Europeans' technological future. So first of all, I want to pass the floor to Alexander. Why does Europe need to be a global digital player and to achieve its technological sovereignty as declared by the European Commission?
Well, I think the answer is actually quite simple, and that is that we're in the midst of a digital revolution, fourth industrial revolution, whatever we want to call it, which will have an impact and has an impact on the local level, on the national level, on the regional level, and on the global level with basically everything that we do. It will change the economy and the way in which we work. It will change politics, the way in which we communicate and organize societies. And at the end of the day, I would argue that it will change the way in which we are as human beings. So it's basically cutting edge technology change in the world. And if you're not cutting edge yourself, someone else is going to be setting the rules for you. And I'd much rather the good guys do the algorithms rather than bad guys. And I consider us, the Europeans, to be pretty good guys on this without hopefully sounding too arrogant.
Yeah, and also given your experience from the European Investment Fund, why haven't we gotten further today? I mean, we have the ambitions, but where are the results?
Yeah, I guess we've gone a bit topsy-turvy. I mean, here we are, 2 Swedes and a Finn talking about technology. And if we had been here in the 1990s, we would have probably been the superstars with Nokia and Ericsson and the hardware and the handsets. And now we're pretty much the wannabes trying to catch up with the giant tech companies of this world, both on the hardware and on the software side. So, we've sort of been left behind a little bit. We didn't go for what I would call a digital internal market in 2000 because of the resistance of some member states. And to be honest, there's a resistance of some big communications and telecom companies as well. And now we're pretty much playing catch up. I think the way in which you put it in your introduction, and actually also in your Dagens Industri article that you wrote this week, I think is a good indication of why we are behind and why we have to fight back. But I will reveal at the end of the day why I'm still optimistic that we'll make a good comeback.
That sounds very good. Nicklas, well, what is your take? Why do we see this lack of large scale tech companies and innovation in Europe today, given the position we had a decade or so ago?
I would suggest that there are two different frames that you can apply to this problem. One is to say that we've been left behind and that we're catching up, which is this idea that technology has this state that you need to reach in order to make sure that you are on level with the rest of the world. That frame is often used, and it seems to be ingrained in European politics. But the reality is that Europe's technological future cannot be the US technological past. So it cannot be competing about the kinds of industries and technologies that have been successful in the US. Just as Alexander reminded us, we actually were at the forefront of technological innovation and on technological markets overall in the 1990s. We wrote the first really rigorous policy paper about technology with the Bangemann report that came out in 1994. And what we've been doing since is that we have forgotten that we used to be the leaders, and we're relitigating the last wave of technology instead of focusing on and investing in the next wave of technology. So we need to be much more nuanced here. Talking about technology and a digital player obscures the fact that digital comes in different waves. The consumer technology industry, the consumer digital markets, they have largely been successfully explored and grown by US companies. But that doesn't mean that biotech or Industry 4.0 or any of those other waves will actually be monopolized by the Americans as well. There's a clear reason for why consumer tech and consumer digital services are much more grown in the US, and that is you have domestic access to more than 300 million users in the US. Whereas if you're trying to scale up in Europe, you quickly hit regulatory complexity such that you just decide to go elsewhere. This scale-up flight problem is the core reason why Europe has been lagging behind in growing consumer services. That doesn't have to happen with Industry 4.0, just as it did not happen with GSM and mobile phones. So my sense here is that we're asking the wrong question. We're asking about catching up. We're asking about, it's almost like we think Europe would be okay if we just had our own search engine. You know, we need a European search engine. That's competing with yesteryear's technology rather than competing with where technology will be in 2 or 3 years. And I think that sort of focus, that anchoring in the past, is ultimately harming Europe's technological progress because you're not asking the right questions. It's, you know, Wayne Gretzky, I will now use a horrible sports metaphor because I know nothing about sports, but this notion of skating to where the puck is, that's what Europe needs to do. That's where its technological future is. Instead, it's skating to where the puck was in 1990, roughly, where the first search engines emerged. And I think if we can get past that, we could probably do much better. And I think that's something that is largely also obscured by this notion that there's there's one single monolithic phenomenon that we can describe as the digital market, which is clearly not true. If you look at the waves of technology rolling in, health tech, Industry 4.0, energy tech, all of those different things that we could successfully develop and employ in Europe if we were just focused on thinking about where we'd go next.
But a follow-up question: that is there not a qualitative difference in that if we think of biotech or energy tech? I mean, the information technology giants, they become infrastructure. I mean, our way we understand the digital world is mediated by Facebook, by Google, by Twitter, and they are not only big companies, they're also an infrastructure layer, which, I mean, even if you have the biggest, most scalable biotech company you can ever have, that still doesn't have the same effects as, for instance, Apple app stores, through which everyone needs to, be able to be accessed through smartphones, for instance. So is that a reason for sprinting towards the puck was because these companies have become infrastructure in ways that, energy tech cannot be, or?
Well, energy is the paramount example of infrastructure, frankly. And I think that industry will produce more data in Europe than the consumer industry has ever produced. I think there's a point to what you're saying about infrastructure, but I also think that there's a small part of our information flows that's currently consumer oriented, that's on platforms in different ways. And that's certainly important and shouldn't be ignored. On those platforms, by the way, you find European newspapers, European academic institutions, European actors in multiple different ways. So it's not as if the content layer of those platforms is being monopolized by the tech giants. So they are certainly enablers, but they're not necessarily in a strong censorship precision when it comes to sort of picking and choosing. If you were to try to, access Dagens Nyheter or any other large publication, you would successfully be able to do so without using the platforms at all. And there's so much more to the internet than just the platforms. And I think if you look at the commercial value that can be unlocked, if you look at the real sort of economic growth that can be unlocked and be useful to European citizens, then those other waves that we're talking about, health tech and energy tech, Industry 4.0, they're immensely valuable as compared to the consumer markets. So, and I do think there are actually good cloud companies growing in Europe as well that could easily integrate within this. And ultimately, I also, there is a tension here that I'd like to sort of just hint at, and that is this notion that, it's US or Europe. I actually think that we have a transatlantic community of values that we should be very, very happy for, and that we should work hard to keep, and start thinking about what does a transatlantic version of this look like, rather than think about the US and Europe. Europe has been locked in this notion of competition with the US for a very long time. I mean, it's obvious as early as in the Bangemann report, but at that point we were leading, and then it comes back in the Lisbon agenda. And sort of the reality is that if you want to be a player in a world where there are billion people markets, China, India, you need to be a billion player market. The way Europe gets to be that is by joining with the transatlantic markets overall. The US plus Europe can be a billion people market, can be super powerful and really potentially unleash an enormous amount of economic growth.
I think that's a very interesting note, and I think that I will, give Alexander the opportunity to react there, and I will also pick up on one of the things you talked about, the regulatory burden, and that's also something that we found. We this spring published a report, European Tech Insights, on citizens' attitudes to technology, and in the US, in China, and in Europe, most of them, when asked, why is this lack of innovation happening in Europe, and everyone was saying, well, it's the regulatory burden. Alexander, do you share that view? Do you see that the digital single market is the way out of there, and how do we get that? How do we get there?
Well, before I get there, I mean, I should probably say that I actually agree with pretty much everything that Nicklas said, and I think his approach is I think realistic, but at the same time very optimistic, and I do think that we're sort of fighting old wars in many ways. And I think because my dad is the chief scout of the National Hockey League here in Europe, and all the European ice hockey players that go to the NHL go through him. So I think the original allegory is that don't be where the puck is, be where the puck is going to be. And I think in that way, Gretzky was right on that. I'll give you just one example. I'm wearing, and this is not product placement, but I'm wearing a ring called Oura. And I'm not gonna, show you the middle finger where I have it, but it's basically a Finnish product, a spin-off from some old Nokia people up in Oulu. So we're above the Arctic Circle here, and it measures my sleep and basically my living condition, if you will, and does it in an extremely fancy way with a really wonderful app and the rest of it. This is exactly the type of, how would I say, data mining or technological thinking that we should be looking at. We shouldn't be crying about Google, or we shouldn't be crying about Facebook and Twitter and Amazon and the rest of it. They're part of the big infrastructure, I think, in all of this. And you did ask me, Oscar, earlier about investment at the European Investment Bank. Before I went there, I think money was put and invested in a European search engine, I think called Quant at the old day. I mean, do I go to Quant myself? Well, I do on occasion, but am I a Google type of a person? Well, yes, I am. So I do think that we need to think about this broadly. And here is where I try to answer your question. The European Union has one competitive advantage above, say, China and the US, which are either the partners or competitors, depending on how you look at it. And that is that it's a regulatory superpower. I know this sounds damn scary to people, but when Europe regulates, the rest of the world follows. Yes, we might be seeing networks which start having very distinct features, own type of internets in China and the rest of it. But I think at the end of the day, if and when a strong partnership, and here's where I'm 100% with Nicklas, a strong partnership is forged between the United States and the European Union on regulatory frameworks, on innovation, on data sharing, and these types of things, then I think this continent, together with the North American continent, will probably end up coming up on top on this. Europe has also another competitive advantage, and that is linked to privacy and the notion of the way in which data is used. And you only have to ask yourself the question, and I don't remember, Oscar, you can remind me, but Ursula von der Leyen in her speech put a really nice brand on it. It wasn't sort of, secure data made in Europe or something like that. Well, it does sort of ring a nice bell. Or would you go for secure data made in China? Well, so you have many different ways of looking at this, but I think we really need to move beyond this. Oh my God, we lost the battle against the Americans. And look at Kai-Fu Lee's AI superpowers. He doesn't even talk about Europe. It's all about China and Europe. And then everyone gives this bloody list of, the top 40 tech companies from Forbes 500 list, all being Chinese and Americans. This is an old battle. Let's look forward and see where we can find. Data is going to be about combining, as was mentioned, biology and technology. It's going to be about climate data. There's so many different strands that can be used in this. And as long as we have, I think, a functioning infrastructure and we're able to use that, then companies will start growing like mushrooms around it.
And I think that's a very good and optimistic vision. I think it's a good. It is a good goal for Europe to strive for. But I also have to ask, recently we had the verdict in what's called the Schrems II case, which in essence says that transferring European data to the US should be illegal because it cannot live up to European privacy standard. So that seemed to be a kind of a big stumbling block in forging that European transatlantic cooperation on this. I don't know if anyone you want to comment this.
Yeah, no, I think it's right. I agree with Alexander. I think there's value in rules. There's huge value in rules. If you play chess, there's no value in playing chess unless there are rules for the board. And nobody would play chess without rules. And when you have a maturing industry, which the consumer internet industry really is, rules for that industry is something that I think everyone benefits from. So I don't think that anyone is specifically saying anything else than the fact that we need rules. And I think Europe has a good position to come up with rules. Europe has a long regulatory history stretching back to Rome, and it has an understanding for regulatory rights and interests that is far more oriented towards human rights than commercial interests, which I think is helpful in the long term if you want to build trust in technology. So the way that Europe regulates is actually inspiring trust in many ways, and I think that's helpful too. Now the challenge is to find the balance, because Schrems 2.0 points to something really important, and that is that if you want to be a regulatory superpower, your regulatory structure cannot be inherently isolationist. Because if it's inherently isolationist and it cuts you off from everyone else because your standards are so high that it's not possible to work transatlantically, much less with any other part of the world that doesn't even come close to an equivalence decision under the GDPR, then at that point you're going to sort of lose. Your regulatory superpower can only be exercised in the way that it's negotiating new ways of projecting itself. It's a kind of soft power, if you will, and soft power requires at least a basic agreement around the fact that you're going to collaborate at some point in the future. If you're cutting people off with too strong a regulation, then I think you have a problem. Now, I have good faith in the European Commission and in their ability to come up with something that will replace Schrems 2.0, but I think we can learn something really important from the court's decision. And that is, a regulatory superpower is only as strong as its ability to project that soft power across other domains in the basic spirit of collaboration. Otherwise, your regulatory superpower is going to be deeply isolationist. You have the same regulatory superpower as a country raising walls around itself. In a way, that would be sort of the antithesis of a superpower, really, because then you become just an isolated market.
And I think this is probably where you need to sort of, how would I say, educate the legislators. I remember my times in the European Parliament, 2004, 2008. It's a very unusual parliament in the sense that it has a hell of a lot of power, but limited responsibility. Whereas in national parliaments, you're exactly the opposite. But that I mean to say is that when the Commission provides an initiation of legislation, then at the end of the day, it's the European Parliament, together, of course, with the member states, that decides what it looks like. Now, at that time, when I was there, the sort of nemesis was very much, the US and privacy and big tech that was growing and the rest of it. Now, if you change that narrative in the European Parliament, they start saying, well, are the American tech giants bad? Compare them to, say, Chinese tech giants. Then you get a slightly different, probably, debate coming along. And I think sort of, the idea of trying to find the right balance, don't, build walls around. I mean, I know the GDPR was heavily criticized in the beginning and probably has a lot of cumbersome stuff, but I'm just a humble consumer who presses I agree with everything and all the cookies policies and the rest of it. But I heard from, well, I won't name him, but one of the biggest tech giants himself, well, he actually thinks the GDPR is good, but for reasons that perhaps small tech companies won't like. So there are elements of this, and I think Europe needs to get its balance right, and I hope that it will also with the Schrems 2.0.
I would, starting to round off this discussion, I would be very curious to hear from both of you. What would be your key priorities for van der Leyen in really tackling Europe's technological future for the years to come?
I guess I was trying to become the Commission president, so I should answer first. So I think there are probably, three key issues that she needs to focus on, and obviously they were the ones that she outlined in her State of the Union address. One is data, a link to data, probably issues of privacy and secure data in a right kind of a way. The second one, I would argue, is innovation and funding. And here is where I think these sort of new forms of hybrid fundings coming from partially private banks and public banks, as the European Investment Bank would be, is quite useful, because just pouring public money into innovation is a bit of a, not a dead end, but not necessarily the most efficient way of doing it. And as a matter of fact, quick anecdote on that, lovely Swedish company which recycles shower water, we funded them with, I don't remember how many million, from the EIB. And I asked, why did you come to the EIB? They said, well, actually they went to Silicon Valley and looked at venture capitals, but didn't get as good of a deal. So this is a good, sign of innovation. And the final one is the infrastructure. Just, I can't stress enough how important 5G is and functioning infrastructure. And I'm not only talking about, not getting reception on a German Autobahn. We just need to be better on this.
Thank you very much for those. Nicklas, your thoughts?
Well, I think it would be useful to think about how the US tech wonder was originally achieved. One of the core reasons behind that can be sought out in a 1950s book by a guy called Vannevar Bush called Endless Frontier, in which he sort of lays out the importance for public funding of basic research, figuring out things that seem like big bets, seem like almost outlandish, low probability, high impact things, thinking about science as a core task for the common good, and really investing in it, and not just having companies invest in it, because they will always be investing towards applied research more, but driving those investments up. It's something that we've failed to do since the Lisbon Agenda. The 3% target that we had is only reached by a few Scandinavian actors, and it's so important. It's also important because it represents an attitudinal shift. If you're so focused on research, if you're so focused on discovery, you're actually going to teach the next generation something about what's important. And we need to make sure that this meshes with our systems overall. We need to make sure that, you know, our public procurement systems can fund innovation. Currently they can't. Our public procurement systems are horrible at funding things that don't exist. Yet still, we have an enormous public procurement budget across the European Union, almost entirely concentrated to the individual member states and not cross-border at all. There's tons of stuff you can do there in order to improve funding that's actually oriented towards applied research as well. And then I think we should be more bold about the story and narrative. I think story matters a ton. If Europe were to set up, say, 10 grand innovation prizes, saying that if you're able to present a technology that will sequence the human genome 10x faster than you can do today, there's 100 million euro in it for you if you share it openly with the world. Those kinds of things have signal value. They create a story around research and progress. They look forward. They don't relitigate the past. I think that really unleashes the power in the regulatory superpower as well. If you're a regulatory superpower with this sort of obsessive focus on research, on innovation, on progress, I think you can come much, much further than if you're relitigating the past and you're trying to win the last market, that sort of the market of yesteryear. So I think those things are really important in addition to what Alexander rightly points to. And I think this is a story that's largely been lost in Europe. And that's slowly being regained in the US. And I think that the US and especially China are focusing so much more on research now, on investing in research and making progress there, that risks being the real reason for us lagging behind, not when it comes to consumer tech, but when it comes to all of the coming waves of technology that we want to be a part of. So my sense is, double down on that. Don't make research and development sort of something you mention in passing. Make it the centerpiece of a European value. We speak about European values all the time. Progress should be a European value. It isn't today. If you go through the European value text from the commissions, if you go through everything, progress, real progress, curiosity, scientific accomplishment, all of those should be European values. And when we talk about European values, we should really make sure that that's what's at the front of what we talk about, is my sense.
I think that's fantastic, and I mean, I'm very happy to hear that, not only as you know, working at a university and being a scholar, not only as a techno optimist, because I fundamentally believe in what you say. Last chance to get a reaction, Alexander.
It's always wonderful to talk Finns and Swedes together. I think we improve the world exponentially, and threw in some tech optimism here, which is much needed. And, you know, if you look at the post-COVID world, Europe did a bloody good job. A lot of other places in this world are in a big old mess at the moment. I'm not saying we're out of it, but, you know, there's something to this big narrative that Nicklas talked about as well. So I'm rather upbeat about the future of Europe and the European Union, and especially of Finland, Sweden, and Italy.
That's fantastic, Alexander.
Good news.
Nicklas, Alexander, thank you so much for joining. You'll find our research at cgc.ie.edu, and until next time.